we are already done with one small book on Indus Valley. Like it was about the daily lives of the people, but it didn't really help us much, and I would not recommend it for UPSC. Let's begin with this new one. I have high hopes from this because it's like a 200-page long book, so it might take time to finish it off. This is about the Indus Valley, the lost civilization. It's by Andrew Robinson. Mm, um, okay, it's discussing a lot of things in each chapter. So first we can like go through the chronology quickly, just a couple of pages. 7,000 to 2,600 BCE, village habitation at Mehergarh in Balochistan, wheat and barley civilization, cultivation, domestication of cattle, 5,000 rice cultivation in China and India, Ganges Valley, middle of 4th millennium BC, urbanization at Uruk, Mesopotamia, 3,500 settlement at Harappa and Punjab, 2,500, 2,600 early period of Indus Valley, 3,100 BC cuneiform scripts begins in Mesopotamia, hieroglyphic scripts begin in Egypt. First half of the 3rd millennium, Gilgamesh of Uruk reigns, Mesopotamia, 2600 to 2500 pyramids constructed at Giza, Egypt. 101st dynasty of Ur, Mesopotamia, trade between Mesopotamia and Indus Valley begins. 2600 to 1900, mature period of Indus civilization, cities as Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, Sindh. Indus script is used throughout the civilization. 2400 to 1500, Bactria and Margiana archaeological complex, BMAC, Turkmenistan and Afghanistan. 2334 to 2279, Sargon of Akkad reigns. Mesopotamia trades with Meluha, Indus Valley. 2nd millennium BC, Indo-Aryan speaking people migrate from west into the northwest India. 1900 to 1700, later period of Indus civilization, cities and Indus script decline. 15 alphabets begin in Egypt, Palestine and Sinai. 1800, trade between Mesopotamia and Indus Valley declines. 1792 to 1750, Hammurabi of Babylon reigns, Mesopotamia. 1600 to 1050, Shang civilization, China. Chinese culture script develops. 1500 to 500, composition of Rig Veda, followed by other Vedic literature in Sanskrit. 1361 to 1352, Tutankhamun reigns Egypt. 1300, Harappa ceases to be inhabited. 1200, collapse of civilization in Eastern Mediterranean, Knossos, Mene, Troy, new kingdoms, Egypt and others. 800, cities began in Ganga Valley. 563 to 483, life of Siddhartha Gautam, founder of Buddhism. 522 to 486, Darius the Great reigns in Persia. 326 BC, Alexander the Great invades Indus Valley. 300 to 400, composition of Hindu epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata. 269 to 232 BC, reign of Ashoka, Brahmi, Kharosti scripts begin. 1920s, Indus civilization discovered, excavation begins. 1947, partition of Indus sites between India and Pakistan. 1980, Mohenjo-daro inscribed in the World List of Heritage by UNESCO. This is the bust of the priest king from Mohenjo-daro in the Indus Valley. One enigmatic world. In the civilization, Kenneth Clark's study of the Western civilization based on his pioneering 1960s television series. The eminent art historian pondered the non-Western origins of civilization 2.5 millennia before the classical Greeks, he observed. Kenneth Clark. TV series. Alright, here's an art historian that I can make. 3 or 4 times in history, man has made a leap forward that would have been unthinkable under the ordinary evolutionary conditions. One such time was about the 3000 BC, when quite suddenly civilization appeared not only in Egypt and Mesopotamia but also in the Indus Valley. Another was in 6th century BC, when there was not only the miracle of Ionia and Greece, philosophy, science, art, poetry, and reaching a point that wasn't reached again for the 2000 years, but also in India, a spiritual enlightenment that has perhaps never been equaled. Ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia are familiar to the world because of their art, architecture, royal burials, their extensive text, Returning Egyptian hieroglyphs, and Sumerian and Babylonian cuneiform, and numerous references to the Egyptian pharaohs and Babylonian and Persian rulers in the Hebrew Bible and Greek and Roman literature. So, two are the glories of the classical Greeks and Greece, and many, maybe less so, the spirituality of Buddhist India, roughly contemporary with Greek philosophy, and early Hindu India, as expressed in Vedic literature, probably composed between 1500 and 500 BC. Not so familiar, however, is the civilization that appeared in the Indus Valley, in what is now Pakistan and India. During the first half of the 3rd millennium BC, Indus Valley civilization was, in its own way, an extraordinary as civilization of Egypt and Mesopotamia, but it declined around the 19th century BC and left no direct legacy in the Indian subcontinent. Neither Alexander the Great, who invaded India from northwest in the 4th century BC, nor Ashoka Maurya, the great Buddhist-oriented emperor who ruled most of the subcontinent in the 3rd century BC, was even dimly aware of the Indus civilization, nor were the Arab, Mughal, European colonial rulers of India during the next 2 millennia. Indeed, amazing as it may seem, the Indus civilization remained altogether invincible until the 1920s, when it was almost accidentally discovered at Harappa in Punjab by the British and the Indian archaeologists during Clark's youth. Ever since then, scholars have been trying to elucidate its mysteries, including the meaning encoded in the characters of its aesthetically exquisite but stubbornly undeciphered writing system, and thereby to elevate this most significant of lost civilization to the position it deserves, both in the history of South Asia and in the world. Mohenjo-daro, one of the two leading cities of Indus civilization along with Harappa, seen from air, it is located in southern Pakistan near the Indus River. This is the map. Rangpur, northern Kotputiji. Important approximately 1000 sites of Indus civilization and adjacent areas. Most sites belong to mature period from 2600 to 1900 BC, but some are older, in case as early as 7000 BC. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro. Archaeologists have identified well over 1000 settlements belonging to the Indus civilization to its various phases. They cover at least 800,000 square kilometers of what in 1947 became Pakistan and India, an area approximately a quarter the size of Western Europe, with an original population of perhaps 1 million, the same as the ancient Rome at its height. This was most extensive urban culture of its time, but twice the size of its equivalent in Egypt or Mesopotamia, though most Indus settlements were villages. Some were towns and at least 5 were substantial cities. The two largest cities, Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, located some 600 kilometers apart beside the Indus River, and one of its many tributaries were comparable with the cities like Memphis in Egypt and Ur in Mesopotamia during the mature period of the Indus civilization, that is between about 2600 and 1900 BC. The maximum population probably never exceeded 50,000, although life expectancy was good, judging from the human bones in the cemetery at Harappa. Nearly half of the individuals reached the mid-30s and almost one-sixth lived beyond the age of 55. However, the cities, despite their excellent brick built construction, do not boast pyramids, palaces, temples, graves, statues, paintings, or hoards of gold like those found in Egyptian um, Mesopotamia. The grandest building is the so called Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro, the earliest public water tank in the ancient world, a rectangle measuring 12 meters by 7 meters with two wide staircases to the north and south leading down to a brick floor at the maximum depth of 2.4 meters, made watertight by a thick layer of bitumen. Although technically astonishing for its time, without a doubt, the Great Bath was totally unadorned by carving or paintings, so far as archaeologists can tell. Yet, Indus society, fed by crops, watered by the great river and its many tributaries flowing from the Himalayas, was remarkable, productive, and sophisticated in other ways. For example, the Indus dwellers constructed ocean going merchant ships that sailed as far as the Persian Gulf and the river based cities of Mesopotamia, where the Indus made jewelry, weights, inscribed seals, and other objects have been excavated dating back to around 2500 BC. Mesopotamian cuneiform inscriptions refer to the Indus region by the name Meluha, the precise meaning of which is unknown. The Indus cities' drainage and sanitation were built 2 millennia ahead of those of the Roman Empire. Besides the Great Bath, they included magnificent circular wells, elaborate drains running beneath core belt arches, and the world's first toilet. The city's well planned streets, generally laid out in the cardinal directions, put to shame all but the town planning of the 28th century AD. Some of their many personal ornaments, such as necklaces and the finely drilled bioconical Cardanian beads up to 13 centimeters in length, found in the Royal Cemetery of Ur in Mesopotamia, rival the treasures of the Egyptian pharaohs. The binary decimal system of standardized waste, consisting of stone cubes and truncated spheres, is unique in the ancient world, suggesting a highly developed economy. And the partially pictographic characters and vivid animals and human motifs. Of the tantalizing Indus script, inscribed in small seals, stones, and terracotta tablets, occasionally in metal, form little masterpieces of controlled realism with a monumental strength in one sense out of all proportions to their size, and in another entirely related to it, enthused the best known excavator of the Indus civilization, Mortimer Wheeler. Mortimer Wheeler. Once seen, the seal stones are never forgotten as witness the more than 100 differing decipherments of the Indus script proffered since 1920, some of them by distinguished academics such as Egyptologist Flinders Petrie, not to mention many amateurs and cranks. India's archaeology has come a long way in almost a century nonetheless. It throws up many more unanswered fundamental questions than the archaeology of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia and China. A great cloud of unknowns hangs over the civilization, noted an Indus scholar, Jane McIntosh, in 2002. Moreover, all this excavation continues in both Pakistan and India. Less than 10% of just over 1,000 mature period settlements have been excavated. Important clues, including further inscriptions, unquestionably remains to be dug up, as has happened in the past 2 or 3 decades. But given the already extensive excavation of the cities, it does not seem likely that new discoveries will solve all the current questions about the Indus Valley civilization. Therefore, this book, like all books on the subject, must mix hard information from archaeology with informed speculation in trying to answer these questions. Is the Indus seal showing a unicorn, a ritual offering, stand and sign made of steatite from Mohenjo-daro? The writing system is yet to be deciphered. In particular, was civilization and indigenous development apparently emerging from neighboring Balochistan, where there is ample of evidence for village settlement at Mehergarh as early as 7000 BC? Or was it stimulated by growth of civilization in not so distant Mesopotamia during the 4th millennium BCE? What type of authority held together such an evidently organized, uniform, and widespread society, if it truly did manage to prosper without palaces, royal graves, temples, powerful rulers, and even priests? Why does the Indus civilization offer no definitive evidence for warfare in the form of defensive fortification, metal weapons, and warriors, a situation without parallel in war-addicted ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China, not to mention all subsequent civilization? Was the Indus religion the origin of Hinduism, or is the barren resemblance of some Indus seal iconography and practice to much later in Hindu iconography and practices, such as the worship of the god Shiva and the caste system based on the wishful thinking? Is the Indus language that is written in the indeciphered script assuming only a single written Indus language related to still existing Indian languages, such as the Dravidian languages of South India or the Sanskrit languages of North India? Lastly, why did the Indus civilization decline after about 1900 BC? Why did it leave no trace in the historical record? The characters of the Indus script seem to have become indecipherable almost 1,000 years ago with the civilization's decline. They certainly bear no resemblance to the next writing that appeared in India. After an enormous gap of millennium and a half, and Brahmi, Kharoshthi alphabetic scripts used to write the rock and pillar inscriptions of Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE, which were modeled on an alphabetic script from West Asia. Scholars and archaeologists and linguists from Europe, India, and Pakistan, Japan, Russia, and United States have suggested answers to these fascinating questions, but inevitably they have been obliged to speculate. There can be no overall consensus for the lack of sufficient archaeological evidence, and because the Indus script is mute. To complicate matters, some of the debates have acquired a partisan political edge. The discovery of the Indus Valley civilization, understandably, promoted national pride during India's movement towards independence from British rule in the 1930s and 40s. Its first excavator, John Marshall, started the trend in 1931 by claiming that the religion of the Indus people is so characteristically Indian as hardly as to be distinguishable from the living Hinduism. The Indian nationalist leader Jawaharlal Nehru, before he became Prime Minister of independent India, noted reasonably enough, it is surprising how much there is in Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, which reminds one of the persisting traditions and habits, popular rituals, craftsmanship, even some fashions and dress. Since then, however, and especially since the 1980s, Hindu nationalists in India have gone much further, disregarding archaeological and linguistic evidences in support of an openly political agenda. They are keen to recruit the Indus civilization as the Fons et Origo of Indian civilization. Fons et Origo, the source and origin of something.
Fons et Origo.
Fons et Origo, of untainted by outside influence. According to them, it was originator of the language of Vedic literature, Sanskrit. This they view as indigenous language rather than one descendant among many languages of the Proto-Indo-European languages that originated in Pontic Caspian steppes of southern Russia during the 4th millennium and reached India in the 2nd millennium via Indo-Aryan speaking migrants from Central Asia. The dominant view among non-Indian scholars regarding the origin of Sanskrit, they also view the Indus civilization as originator of an early form of Hinduism. Thus, the Hindu nationalists promote the Indus civilization as the source of continuous Indian identity, dating back more than 5 millennia. In the late 1990s, certain Indian historians wishing to rewrite school textbooks at the behest of India's new nationalist government appealed a new book, a deciphered Indian script, Indus script, written by two Indians with some linguistic and scientific credentials. Its authors Jha and S.N.S. Rajaram made astounding claims announced to the Indian press in 1999 and press in 2000. The Indus script was said to be even older than had been thought. The mid-third millennium BCE, dating back to the mid-fourth millennium, making the world's oldest readable writing, predating Mesopotamian cuneiforms and Egyptian hieroglyphs. It apparently employed some kind of alphabet 2 millennia older than the earliest known alphabet from the Near East. Perhaps most sensational of all, at least for Indians, the Indus inscriptions were supposedly written in Vedic Sanskrit. One of them was found to mention the crucial Vedic river, the Saraswati, albeit obliquely. Ila surrounds the blessed land. This river, highly revered in the Rig Veda, is today not visible above ground as a single stream, but is nevertheless known from ground surveys to have been a major river during the Indus civilization. Surveys on Pakistani side of the India-Pakistan desert border region conducted in 1970s have traced much, though not all, of the Saraswati's former course, part of which flowed in parallel with the Indus rather than its tributary. In the course of their surveying, the archaeologists led by Muhammad Rafiqi Mughal stumbled upon close to 200 settlements from the mature period of the Indus civilization clustering along the ancient course of Saraswati, almost all of which, including a city, Ganveriwala, await excavation. Providential further support for Hindu nationalist views seemed to come from a form of an excavation photograph from 1920s showing a broken Indus seal inscription depicting the handy quarters of an animal accompanied by 4 characters. Jha and Rajaram claimed that animal was horse as shown in a computer-enhanced drawing published by them, and that the 4 characters could be read in Vedic Sanskrit as Arko Ha Asva, which they translate as son indeed like the horse. The authors translated another Indus script which was discovered in 1990 in Gujarat and is generally regarded as some kind of monumental signboard, as I was 1,000 times victorious over every curious raiders, desirous of my wealth of horses. But horses were unknown to the Indus civilization. Almost all scholars had maintained, since they were not depicted among the many motifs of animal, including buffaloes or its seals and in its art, and no horse bones had been discovered by excavators, or at least no bones that convinced zoo archaeologists specializing in horse identification. The bones of wild ass onager are known in Indus Valley, but not horse bones. The horse is generally thought to have arrived in northwestern India only with horse-drawn chariots of the Indo-Aryan speaking migrants during the mid-2nd millennium BC. Certainly, in the later Indian history, armies imported their horses from outside. Horses are, however, abundantly mentioned in the Vedic literature, if after all, horse did feature in Indus civilization as Jha and Rajaram claimed. Was this not important evidence that the creators of the Indus inscriptions and authors of Vedic literature were one and same, the indigenous horse riding people? The argument in the deciphered Indus script would probably have been ignored by most people, as had happened with all but a handful of Indus script decipherments announced since the 1920s by both Indian and non-Indian scholars. But on this occasion, because of their potentiality, explosive educational and political implication, the book attracted widespread public attention both in the South Asia and even internationally. Within months, the author's claim of successful decipherment were easily demonstrated to be nonsense in articles for national news magazines in India written by scholars, notably Iravatham Mahadevan, the leading Indian expert on the Indus script, Asko Parpola, the leading non-Indian expert, and Michael Witzel, a professor of Sanskrit at Harvard University, with his collaborator Steve Farmer. Mahadevan termed the so-called decipherment completely invalid and non-starter. Witzel and Farmer's chief article was entitled Horseplay in Harappa. They demonstrated beyond question, even for non-specialists, that Indus script alphabet was so absurdly fixable that it could be manipulated to produce almost any translation that book authors might desire. Furthermore, the supposed Indus Valley horse was revealed after comparison of the broken seal photograph and photograph of various similar looking but more complete Indus seals to be a unicorn, bull of a type commonly depicted in the inscription, not a horse. The so-called horse had to be a hawk's image created by one of the authors, an Indian-born, US-trained engineer with experience of computer drawing and a taste for Hindu nationalist propaganda, as he more or less admitted under questioning by Indian journalists. Yet, despite the scholarly expose of the particular book's intellectual bankruptcy, the Indian government's old textbooks introduced in 2002 refer to terracotta figurines of horses in Indus Saraswati civilization and continue to do so until the fall of the Hindu nationalist government in 2004. The textbook were withdrawn by the incoming government. More important, the idea that language of the Indus civilization is Sanskrit and of local origin continues to enjoy wide support in India, including from some archaeologists and linguists until such time as the Indus script is convincingly deciphered, which will not happen without major new discoveries of inscriptions. This heated debate about the Indus civilization's true relationship with the later Vedic culture will surely continue. That said, the cultural importance of the former Saraswati River, unrecognized in the 1920s, is beyond dispute. In this respect, the Indus or Saraswati civilization, many archaeologists prefer Harappan civilization after its place of discovery, resemble ancient Mesopotamia, where civilization developed between the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, rather than the ancient Egypt, where civilization was the gift of a single river, the Nile. However, the Indus geographical environment was more complex and varied than either Mesopotamia's or Egypt's, a fact that influenced the civilization's evolution more than is obvious from the evidence of its cities alone. Whereas the city-states of Mesopotamia, ancient Greek for the land between the two rivers, remained focused on areas watered by these rivers, the intercities, or perhaps they were city-states exerted direct control over a far wider area, often through the large and small settlements which supplied the cities with metals such as copper, semi-precious stones, and minerals and timbers. Beyond the alluvial plains of the Indus Valley, this area may be divided into four regions: the Western Mountains and Piedmont Bode zone, and mountain ranges to the north, and the eastern border zone, and Thar, Great Indian Desert, and peninsular India. The satellite view of Indus River showing the course from Himalaya to the Arabian Sea. The added line is the center right section, marks the international boundary between India, Pakistan, and India. The region west of Indus River are the highlands, the plateaus of Balochistan, and along the rugged Makran coast, where an Indus settlement has been excavated at Sutkajan Dor near the modern border with Iran, and the mountainous area of northern Pakistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. The civilization established a far-flunched settlement, Shortugai, on the northern border of Afghanistan with Tajiki besides the Oxus River, in order to obtain lapis lazuli from sought after minerals, most important mine. Oxus River. It's also called Amud Darya. Most important mine. To the east of the Indus Valley, the ancient Saraswati River was bordered by the Thar Desert, which today covers the ancient states of Rajasthan, parts of Punjab, Haryana, and Gujarat, all which contain settlements of Indus civilization extending almost as far as the foothills of Himalayas in the northeast and the Aravalli ranges in the east. From the latter mountains, the Indus cities obtained steatite for making seal, stones, copper, and other metals. East of the Indus Delta is what is now part of the western Gujarat Valley, the coastal region of Kutch, consisting of many islands in the 3rd millennium BCE. Unlike today's huge salt marsh, the run of Kutch and the peninsula of Saurashtra, both of which contain many Indus civilization settlements, including Dholavira and a port, Lothal, from which ships traded with Mesopotamia. Beyond Saurashtra, the Indian peninsula proper and settlement petered out, yet the Indus civilization obtained large quantities of agate and carnelian from the mines of Pipla in the mine in the hilly eastern Gujarat, and gold from far distant south, Rajpipla. The climate of this vast area would mostly have been beneficial to agriculture if we permit ourselves to judge by today's climate. Two different weather systems currently dominate and sometimes overlap. In the western highlands, a winter cyclonic system operates, and in the peninsular region, a summer monsoon. Winter cyclonic system, both of which produce rainfall. If one of these systems fail to deliver rain, the other one will almost always do. Famine is therefore unknown in the Indus Valley. Western cyclonic system versus summer monsoon. There are 6 traditional seasons: spring from end of February to March, summer April, May, June, and rainy season from end of June to September, autumn, October, November, and winter, and the dewy season from November to February. These create 2 basic growing seasons. In winter and dewy seasons, archaeological evidence show that the ancient farmers grew barley, wheat, oats, lentils, beans, mustards, jejube, and linen. In summer and the rainy season, millet, cotton, sesame, melons, jute, hemp, grapes, dates, rice, which is native part of the subcontinent, was probably introduced to the Indus Valley as a cultivated crop only towards the end of the mature period of the civilization, perhaps around 2000 BCE. However, the 6 seasons and the 2 growing seasons show many variations depending on the region. For instance, as the southern Indus River in Sindh around Mohenjo-daro, the rainfall is often little or nothing, yet the land is rich in silt deposited by flood waters of the river, which compensates for the lack of rainfall. Further north in Punjab, where Harappa is located, rain coming from western highlands in the winter and dewy season can produce in spring fertile harvests and vast grazing in the highlands themselves, where the winter rain falls as snow. The growing season comes later, with planting in spring and harvesting in summer. The juxtaposition of mountain, river plains, and coasts provide a unique pattern of seasonally available resources and abundant materials that is quite different from the situation in either Mesopotamia or Egypt, notes Jonathan Mark Canoyer, key Indus researcher who is one of the recent excavator of Harappa. The diversity of environment, climate, and materials must have been vital to the civilization's prosperity. In ancient Egypt, The annual inundation of the land by the floodwaters of the Nile was the single crucial driver in agriculture and could produce plenty of catastrophe depending on its level. Irrigation canals were necessary in Egypt to extend the reach of flood and to store water. In the Indus civilization, by contrast, there is no evidence for large scale irrigation. Presumably, if a poor harvest happened to befall on Indus region, rescue was provided by another region with an abundant forest harvest by transporting food via established trading network. But is it really safe to assume that today's Indus Valley climate applied 5 millennia ago? And the excavation in the 1920s? Marshall could not make up his mind on this question. In this chief excavation report, he called the climate of Mohenjo-daro region of one of the worst in India, and a temperature ranging from below freezing to some 50 degrees Celsius, bitterly cold winds in winter, and frequently dust storms in the summer. An average rainfall of not more than 15 centimeters, varied by occasional torrential downpours, in addition to clouds of sandflies and mosquitoes. In Marshall's view, it will be found hard to picture a less attractive spot than Mohenjo-daro today. He also noted that historians of Alexander the Great reported a comparable Indus Valley desiccation in the 4th century BCE could have been developed during the preceding millennium after the Indus civilization as part of the evidence for possibly higher rainfall in the 3rd millennium BCE. Marshall observed that Mohenjo-daro's builders used kiln-fired and hence more durable bricks rather than more friable but much cheaper sun-dried bricks. He also noted that some of the animals frequently depicted on the Indus seal stones such as tiger, rhinoceros, elephant, which are not found in the region today, are commonly found in damp, jungly country, unlike the lion, which prefer the dry zone and is not depicted on the seals. But Marshall concluded that none of the evidence was decisive. Kiln-fired bricks may simply have asserted the importance of certain excavated buildings or have been a symbol of luxury. But the disappearance of tiger from Sindh occurred as recently as the 19th century, probably partly as a result of reduction in its habitat by increased animal grazing and the effects of big game hunting. Opinions on Indus climate change remain divided today. After several inconclusive studies, a very recent study suggests there was an abrupt weakening of the summer monsoon at 2100 BC. However, many scholars, including Kenware, think the temperature, rainfall, and monsoon patterns have not changed much since the time of the Indus civilization. A satanic mockery of snow, Mohenjo-daro salination is damaging the bricks and thereby destroying the excavation of some Indus Valley sites. Another change to the southern Indus Valley was gradual introduction from the late 19th century of artificial control of the river with embankments and dams, notably the barrage completed at Sukkur in northern Sindh in 1932, and the construction of extensive irrigation canals. These helped farmers but not archaeologists. Within decades, the over-irrigated lands, including the ruins of Mohenjo-daro, now no longer washed by annual Indus floods, became impregnated with salt, commonly known as saltpeter. Saltpeter. Potassium nitrate. Slightest rainfall would convert the anhydrous salt into hydrous form, whitening the landscape with a brittle shining crust that crushes beneath the steppe like a satanic mockery of snow. Noticed as archaeologists that in 1940s, the process of salinization was accompanied by more than 300% increase in volume of the salt, an expansion disastrous for bricks, which caused the excavated ruins to start crumbling into dust within a few years. At Harappa, there was a parallel destruction of the site by railway contractors and local people in search of bricks for construction purposes. It is fortunate indeed that the forgotten cities of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa were discovered before the Indus civilization became utterly lost to the world, as we shall now see. The two discovery. Perhaps the most famous statement ever made about the Indus civilization concerns its discovery. In September 1924, the article appeared in the Illustrated London News under byline of the Director General of Archaeological Survey of India, John Marshall. It opened dramatically. Not often has it been given to archaeologists that it was given to Heinrich Siegelmann at Trines and Messenia, or to Uril. Steen is the desert of Turkestan to light upon the remains of a long forgotten civilization. It looks, however, at this moment as if we are on the threshold of such a discovery in the plains of the Indus. It had taken a century of significant but little understood discoveries to reach this point. The first hint of historical importance of Harappa came in the 1820s from James Lewis, an East India Company army deserter turned explorer journeying through the Punjab on horseback under the pseudonym Charles Mason. Near the unremarkable small town of Harippa, Mason described a large circular mound, a ruinous brick castle, the remains of buildings on a rocky height, and numerous age-old peepal trees, bespeaking of great antiquity when we remember their longevity, as he recalled in his 1842 travel accounts. Tradition affirms the existence of a city, an incredible 13 courses, some 45 kilometers in extent, which was destroyed by the lust and crimes of the sovereign added Mason. At this time, nothing was known of Indian history before the ancient Greeks, not even the date of the Buddha. Mason tried to relate the mound and other mounds in Punjab to various strongholds supposedly captured by Alexander the Great. But although he came across some unusual objects on the surface of the ruins at Harappa, he found no treasures. Site of Mohenjo-daro's early 1920s, just before the discovery of Indus civilization. In 1853, a British army officer and engineer, Alexander Cunningham, who was serving in Punjab, paid the first of what would be many visits to Harappa. By now, the inscriptions of Ashoka had been substantially deciphered, beginning in 1836, and there was growing interest in archaeology of Buddha. Cunningham saw himself following in the footsteps not of Alexander, but rather of Buddhist pilgrim Xuanzang, who in 630 made a monumental journey from China through northwest India to the land of Buddha in the Ganges Valley. Xuanzang described a great city in Punjab area, Po Fatolo, with 4 stupas, 12 monasteries, and 1,000 monks, perhaps located at Harappa, thought Cunningham. Unfortunately, he had no opportunity to excavate until 1872, and a year after he was appointed as the first Director General of Archaeological Survey. In the intervening period, contractors of the recently established Indian Railway plundered Harappa for brick ballards needed to lay the tracks between Lahore and nearby Multan. By the time Cunningham returned, some massive brick walls had been present on the site's southern mound in 1853, which he had taken to the Buddhist monastery and simply vanished. Nevertheless, he drew up accurate site plans and proceeded to dig for antiquities, some of which he published in 1875. The key find was seal, the very first Indus seal to appear in print, in Cunningham's own words. Alexander Cunningham, the first Director General Archaeological Survey of India, 1871 to 85. The most curious object at Harappa is a seal belonging to Major Clark, Zik, which was found along with two small objects like chess pawns made of dark brown jasper. The seal is a smooth black stone without polish. On it is engraved very deeply a bull without a hump looking to the right with this two star under the neck. Above the bull there is an inscription in 6 characters which quite unknown to me. They are certainly not Indian letters, and as the bull which accompanies them is without a hump, I conclude that the stele is foreign to India. First known in this seal stone as published by Alexander Cunningham in 1875 with a modern impression taken from it. The stone is now at the British Museum in London. Soon though, Cunningham changed his mind, suggesting in 1877 that the seal was of local origin and written in an archaic Indian script from the 5th century BC, in other words, a little older than the Brahmi and Kharoshthi inscription of Ashoka. He even attempted a translation. It is not clear how Malcolm George Clark, an army officer with an interest in Greek numismatics, came by the seal, which Clark, after sharing with Cunningham, donated to the British Museum in 1892. There it was joined in 1912 by more 2 seals from Harappa discovered in 1880s, in which the characters were recognized from the seal script. In the first case accompanied by a unicorn rather than a bull, in second having no animal motifs. The first had been dug up by the district superintendent of police, the second by a farmer, sold the seal to a school inspector, yet another amateur antiquarian among British officials in India at the time. In 1912, these 3 enigmatic Harappan seals were published together in the Journal of Royal Asiatic Society. And this was not all. Besides the Harappan finds, there was pottery and other objects from the sites as well, from Sukhadgandur in Makran and Kalibangan in Rajasthan, discovered during the decades before the 1924, in some cases published in reputable journals. But no scholars was in position to connect up these disparate discoveries because the age of objects was unknown and they lacked any historical context. Like the seals, they were relegated to the status of curiosities. No one suspected the sheer antiquity of Indian civilization. Neither Mason nor Cunningham's successor Marshall. Marshall arrived in India in 1902, Director General without least experience of the subcontinent at the instigation of that energetic, cultured imperialist Viceroy Lord Curzon. Aged only 25, he was a classical archaeologist trained in Crete rather than Alexander or Buddhism in India, the Mediterranean region. In particular, the Minoan civilization of Crete was Marshall's initial point of reference, but he soon dedicated himself wholly to furthering the cause of Indian archaeology. Despite his department's thinly stretched financial resources, the scholarly publication of the 3 British Museum seals in 1912 caught Marshall's attention and therefore played a vital role in the discovery of Indus civilization, notes Asko Barbola. But perhaps not sufficiently for Marshall to give immediate priority to Harappa's excavation. After further objects from the site, including 2 more seals, were purchased by one of his assistants in 1912, he noted precisely that the excavation of Harappa was, when it can be arranged, will be productive, most valuable results, and open up quite a new chapter in the Indian history. He authorized some trial excavations in 1915-16 when it fell victim to the exigencies of the First World War and the war's Indian political aftermath, the stirring of the national movement for independence. When trial excavations by Marshall's assistants finally occurred at Harappa in 1921 to 2 and at Mohenjo-daro in 1922 to 3 and 1923 to 24. Their discoveries were as promising as Marshall had hoped. At Harappa, Dayaram Sanghi dug 3 shallow trenches into 2 mounds, although few structures were found. Well-burnt bricks of unfamiliar dimensions were exposed, as were many interesting artifacts such as pottery, figurines, balls, bangles, crucibles, along with 2 well-preserved seals. The writing was in the same unknown variety of the Brahmi script as those in the British Museum. Sehni confidently informed Marshall, who promptly chided him. No connection between the Harappan seal characters and the Brahmi script has ever been in any measure established, so far as I know. Even so, Marshall expressed strong interest in Harappa excavation in his annual report on the archaeological survey, given the Sehni's digging had touched only the topmost levels of the mounds. 50 feet of the depth remained to be explored, and it is already evident that the examination of these lower strata is likely to lead to valuable discoveries. In Mohenjo-daro, the name means Mound of the Dead in the local Sindhi language. Rakhaldas Banerjee became the first person to recognize the antiquity of the heretofore unknown site. He had been preceded at Mohenjo-daro in 1911 by another archaeologist from Survey, Devadatta Ramakrishna Bhandarkar, who had visited the chief mount in the hope of discovering an impressive Buddhist stupa leg. Those he had spotted elsewhere in Sindhi. He unaccountably Bhandarkar failed to recognize the remained stupa on the top of the mound and concluded, on the basis of the dimensions and shape of the local brick, that the ruins were probably a mere 200 years old, leaving Marshall totally unaware of Mohenjo-daro's potential importance. Banerjees, however, immediately recognized the drum of stupa and began to excavate the stupa's platform. Much more important, in the trench beneath the platform, he discovered 3 seals, the first of their kind to be found outside of Harappa. In early 1923, Banerjee explicitly informed Marshall they are exactly similar to Cunningham's Harappan seals. He was unaware of the Sehni seals. John Marshall, Director General of Archaeological Survey of India, with his 5 officers, staff 1925, soon after Marshall, began to excavate Mohenjo-daro. During the renowned excavation of Mohenjo-daro in 1923 to 24, 7 more seals were discovered in a different mound by another archaeologist, Madhu Sarup Watts. They too resembled those found at Harappa. Watts went to highlight various other similarities between the excavation of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa in a poignant letter to Marshall dated April 1924. It would go a great deal to establish the cultural affinity to Mohenjo-daro with Harappa, and they're lying in one of the same zones of influence when we remember that not only the size of the bricks is the same, 11 times, 5.5 times, 2.5, 2 3/4, but the essential bond between the so-called seals from the 2 places, the strongest and the most valuable link as well, was a crude caricaturing of terracotta figurines, earthen bangles, balls for slings, etc., found essentially to be of the kindred kind. The culminative evidence of finds shows that the site is probably pre-Mauryan, that is predating Ashoka Maurya, though in the absence of datable piece and further and fuller exploration, it would be difficult to assign them a definitive or even an approximately accurate date at present. The seal bricks and other objects from the 2 sides, such as painted and plain pottery, churred knives and flakes, and stone beads physically compared by Marshall. Sehni and Banerjee at a special conference called by Marshall at the headquarters of the Archaeological Survey in far-off Shimla in June. It was quickly apparent to the 3 archaeologists that Harappa and Mohenjo-daro had to belong to the same culture of civilization, as Marshall put it a few years ago. One of the most striking facts revealed by the excavation at Mohenjo-daro and Harappa is the complete uniformity of their culture. Though these two spots are some 400 miles apart, their monuments and antiquities are to all intent and purposes identical. After the conference at Shimla, Marshall settled down to write the article for the Illustrated London News that would announce the dramatic discovery to the world, with due credit to Saini and Banerjee 3 months later. Banerjee thought strangely that the new civilization had some distant connection with the prehistoric civilization of Crete. Marshall's training ground as an archaeologist, but Marshall himself from the very beginning maintained that its origin lays in the Indus Valley and its surrounding region, notwithstanding his lack of any solid evidence in the fashion in the colonial study of Indian history for attributing all high culture in India to influence from West, such as that of the Greek, Romans, and Aryans. Marshall's 1924 article boldly concludes that this forgotten civilization, of which the excavation of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro have now given us the first glimpse, was developed in Indus Valley itself, and just as distinctive of the region as the civilization of the Pharaohs was distinctive of the Nile. The debt which, in the early stages of its development and human race, owed to Nile, to the Danube, to the Tigris, and the Euphrates, it is already known, but much it owed to the Indus and the Ganges has yet to be determined. In the case of the Indus, it is probably true that successive migrations from outside had a useful effect, as they did in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, in promoting the development of indigenous culture, but there is no reason to assume that the culture of the region was imported from other lands, or that its character was profoundly modified by outside influences. He was less sure about the date to begin with. He suggested a tentative 1000 BCE at the earliest, some centuries before the civilization in the Ganges Valley and the Buddha. However, he rapidly rethought this date within a few weeks of his announcement, following the response to it from Mesopotamian archaeologists. They pointed out seals found in Mesopotamia dating from early 3rd millennium BCE that strongly resembled the newly published seals from Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. Clearly, the new found civilization must be the same period or earlier. In due course, Marshall settled on about 3250 and 2750 BCE for flourishing of the Indus cities, a chronology that would in due course be considerably revised by radiocarbon dating in both Mesopotamia and Indus Valley, as we shall see. The Mesopotamianists' response was also responsible for Marshall's original name for the civilization, Indo-Sumerian rather than Indus, reflecting his beliefs that it might have been strongly influenced by Sumer and Mesopotamia, but in the light of the only Indus excavation he personally undertook 1925 to 26, during which the impressive Great Bath was discovered and discovery of a mysterious and sophisticated statute of a so-called priest king in 1927, Marshall settled on the name Indus, on the grounds that Indo-Sumerian was likely to imply a closer connection with Sumer than seems now justified. The term is used throughout his monumental excavation report, Mohenjo-daro, an Indus civilization, published in 1931. The influence of Mesopotamia on the Indus civilization has remained contentious over the decades. Some Sumerologists have gone so far as to claim that Mesopotamians directly colonized the Indus Valley in the 4th millennium BCE, whereas many Indian scholars have argued for the spontaneous birth of the civilization in Indus Valley in total seclusion. In between these extreme positions, other argues that undoubted maritime trades between Indus Valley and the Persian Gulf Mesopotamia was key. For example, Parpola thinks that it was the growth of this trade that triggered the process of full urbanization and led to the creation of the Indus civilization. But Dilip Chakrabarti claims that the growth predates rather than accompanies the beginning of the civilization and cannot be considered in any way as a catalytic factor in the transformation from the early to its mature urban period. Perhaps wisest, if less satisfying, is the caution of Hans Nissen. Although it seems almost inconceivable that such Mesopotamian influences did not play a formative part in the Indus Valley civilization, especially as we know for certain that close mutual connections did exist. There is no definitive evidence to show that exceptional features such as seals, pottery, architectural forms, or even the script are derived from Western prototypes. These problems cannot be solved with the available material. New evidence for the Indus civilization and Oman, coupled with further research in these countries between Indus and Euphrates, is needed. Among those of the contacted marshal after 1924 announcement was Ernest Mackay, a veteran archaeologist then excavating the Sumerian city of Kish on behalf of Field Museum in Chicago. Mackay had originally trained in Egypt and with poetry, served in the British Army in Palestine during the First World War, and then worked as a custodian of antiquities for the government of Palestine. As soon as the extremely busy marshal realized Mackay's interest in the Indus civilization, he invited him to take over the excavations between 1926 and 31. In 5 seasons of work, Mackay, with some help of Sehni, dug extensively at Mohenjo-daro, where he revealed that the street plan that gives today's visitors a sense of walking through the ancient city. Meanwhile, at Harappa, Vaz undertook 8 seasons of work up to 1933 to 34, including the excavation of cemeteries and of complex buildings that Marshall, drawing on the work in Minoan, Crete, insisted the terming a granary despite the lack of remains of grains, unlike at Mehergarh. By the time, however, excavation at Mohenjo-daro and Harappa were forced by budgetary cuts to wind down in 1931, 3 days after starting his final season investigating remains in the northeast of the mound containing the Great Bath, Mackay received a telegram from the headquarters of Archaeological Survey requiring his labor gangs to stop work. Although small-scale work would continue in the Depression years of 1930s, the big field campaigns at Mohenjo-daro and Harappa were suspended. Discovery of pre-screen statues at Mohenjo-daro, 1927. 1944, Indus archaeology received another boost with the appointment of Mortimer Wheeler as Director General of Archaeological Survey. Wheeler excavated at both Harappa and Mohenjo-daro during his 4-year term, using more modern methods than Marshall, based on natural cultural layers rather than Marshall's artificial levels, with constant recording of stratigraphy. Yet Wheeler never published a full report on his work, merely a brief which studied the Indus civilization in 1953, subsequently updated. All of his writings on the subjects are permeated with the long training in the Roman archaeology of Britain, supported by his own military experiences as an officer during the First and the Second World War. In forthright words on Wheeler's collaborator Stuart Pigott, who served in military intelligence in India, writing about the Indus Valley civilization in his prehistoric India to 1002 BCE 1950. To British archaeologists, the inevitable parallel in the Roman supervening upon the prehistoric Iron Age barbarian settlements of his own country, the uniform products of Harappan civilization can be traced with monotonous regularities of a highly organized community under some strong system of centralized government. There is terrible efficiency about Harappan civilization, which recalls all the worst of Rome. One can grudgingly admire the outcome of its ruthless authoritarian regime rather than one admires the civil engineering of the Roman army in the provinces, but with a little real enthusiasm. Rather than accepting the lack of evidence for violence and warfare in Indus Valley civilization, Wheeler chose to reinterpret that evidences that were in support of existence of war, which he regarded as inevitable accomplishments of civilization. At Harappa, for example, the moment he clapped eyes on the chief mound in 1944, he visualized it as a citadel built to protect the city from attack. Having scrubbed at the mound surface and revealed brick lines, he felt his hunch was confirmed. A few minutes' observation had radically changed the social character of the Indus civilization and put it at last into the acceptable secular forces. He trumpeted in his autobiography the virtuous complacency of Indus civilization had dissolved into dust, and instead a thoroughly militaristic imperialism had raised its ugly head amongst the ruins. And Mohenjo-daro Wido decided that some skeleton found lying unburied in the street levels of the latest part of the city were victims of a massacre by iron invaders of the declining Indus cities in the mid-second millennium BCE. On circumstantial evidence, Indra, the Vedic war god, stands accused. Wheeler famously wrote in his report on his 1946 Indus excavation. Both of these compelling ideas and others from Wheeler would remain influential until 1980s and 90s, when they were at last overturned by current archaeologists. Mortimer Wheeler, Director General of Archaeological Survey of India, 1944 to 48, best known as excavator of the Indus civilization. The Wheeler-Pigott paradigm changed Marshall's Harappas from austere, peaceful, perhaps even boring urban merchant burgher whose beliefs were harbingers of Indian ideologies into a people victimized by despotic priest-kings who wielded absolute power from remote citadels where they safeguarded themselves and the gods that justified their authority. The archaeologist Gori Poshel remarked in 2003. Wheeler's term in office as Director General coincided with partition of Indian subcontinent into India-Pakistan in 1947. The new international border passed through the eastern part of the Indus civilization. The political division had the beneficial effect of spurring Indian archaeologists to search for the new Indus site. For example, in Gujarat, where Lothal was discovered in 1954 and Dholavira in 1967, and the northeastern Ganges, Yamuna Ganges yielded Alamgiripur 1958 and Bhagwantpura in 1975. In 1947, a mere 37 Indus sites were known, as opposed to well over 1,000 sites known today, spread over a vastly increased area of both India and Pakistan. Less beneficially, the division of scholarship between the modern borders of Pakistan and India has inhibited the coordination of research projects, notes Rita Wright in a recent study. Of the Indus civilization, for example, the independent Pakistani and Indian surveys of the two rivers, the Hakra in Pakistan and Ghaggar in India, which for parts of course of ancient Saraswati River, lack a clear scholarly synthesis. Furthermore, there is still no consensus on the terminology and chronology of various phases of Indus civilization, especially the transition from early to mature urban period and its process of decline. However, there is an additional reason for this second lacuna, that the civilization's entire development is now universally appreciated to have been rather less uniform than originally understood by Marshall. The early excavators of a mere two cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, for instance, the decline in these cities as the center of the civilization was not matched by a decline in its outer regions. Gujarat and East, where the prosperity is in fact increased during the late period, as revealed by the excavation at Rojdi in Saurashtra between 1982 to 1995. About the civilization's dates, there is greater clarity and a consensus, mainly thanks to the invention of the radiocarbon dating in the United States in 1949. In the late 1950s, there was a radiocarbon laboratory in India, located first in Bombay, later in Ahmedabad, and excavations in Mohenjo-daro in 1964 to 5, the last to be permitted there because of the damage caused by the salinization. George Dallas collected the first series of samples for radiocarbon dating, though he was unable to sample the earliest levels submerged beneath the water table. Thereafter, the techniques was used in all Indus excavation, having appropriate organic samples available for testing as a result of radiocarbon dating combined with refinement of the Mesopotamian chronology. It may now be postulated that the nucleosites of the Indus civilization were founded sometime before 2400 BCE and that they endured in some shape to 18th century BCE. Wheeler argued in 1968 edition of his book. Today it is generally agreed that the mature period lasted from 2600 to 1900 BCE. The most remarkable site discovered since 1947 is probably Mehergarh in Balochistan, located near the Bolan Pass, west of the Indus Valley, less than 200 kilometers north of Mohenjo-daro, because it has suggested how ancient the roots of the Indus civilization are likely to be. In his 1931 excavation report on Mohenjo-daro, Marshall, so often perceptive in his institution, had stated, "It can hardly be doubted that the story already unfolded will be carried still further back on other sites, of which there are multitude waiting to be excavated in Sindhi and Balochistan." Sindhi and Balochistan. Marshall had observed how the explorer Aurel Steen, inspired by the earliest discoveries at Mohenjo-daro, had discovered numerous prehistoric sites in the desert of southern Balochistan, the Makran, in 1927 to 8. Vellore, by contrast, regarded Balochistan as some sort of cultural backwater, quite separate from Indus Valley, without any direct relations between the two cultural spheres. Writes Jean-Francois Jeriche, the archaeologist who discovered Mehergarh in 1974, and spent many years excavating the site with his team to Vellore. The appearance of cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa seems to have been some sort of spontaneous phenomenon. Mehergarh was continuously inhabited by 4.5 millennia from 7000 BCE and is still only agricultural site in its antiquity known in Pakistan or India. Its inhabitants lived in houses made of sun-dried bricks, stored their grains in granaries, made tools out of copper, used bitumen for sealing, baskets and ornaments of lapis lazuli, and fashioned steel seals made of bone, ivory, stone and terracotta. Though there is no evidence for a script, they also created compelling ceramic female figures with prominent breast and beautiful kin, fired pottery painted with swirling fishes and other animals. But it is the settlement's exceptionally early cultivation of plants and domestication of animals that has attracted the most attention. Was agriculture an indigenous invention at Mehergarh, or did it arrive by diffusion from the Near East? The current view is that it was a mixture of both. For example, humped zebu cattle became increasingly better represented in the archaeological records of Mehergarh at the same time as their body decreases, a trend consistent with the indigenous domestication, according to zooarchaeologist Richard Meadow. Wheat and barley cultivation, on the other hand, which is found at Mehergarh, has been documented in Near East of 20,000 years ago. Mehergarh appears to have been abandoned after 2600 BC, around the time of formation of Indus cities. This increases the question whether its inhabitants played some role in the city's formation. The issue is inevitably hard to resolve. However, most archaeologists would agree with Jareje's claim that there are so many direct parallels between the mature Indus urban culture and culture at Mehergarh and some other Indus cities, sites of early inhabitation such as nearby Dusharo and distant Amiri, Kotnechi and Harappa, to leave much doubt that in the early 3rd millennium all of these cultures were integrated within a vast territory with a remarkably inhomogeneous material culture. How the transition to an urban culture actually occurred in the mid-3rd millennium is the subject of much debate. Excavation of early Indus settlements since 1947 shows that more than 3/5 of them were abandoned. Some others were clearly destroyed by the fire, notably Amri, Gumla, Kottichi, and Nusharo, and then reoccupied. The burning was a result of warfare, as some scholars suggest, in the tradition of Vellore. No evidence for weapons has survived within the layers of ash or for violent death in the form of skeleton. Other scholars propose instead that the fires were deliberately started by the inhabitants in order to clear the site, possibly as a ritual act of purification for rebuilding, so that the new settlement could be planned in an orderly manner. Shallow terracotta bowls with swirling fish motif from Mehergarh, 2800 to 2600, in a style known as Faiz Muhammad Grey Bear. Whoever may be right about these sites, there is no evidence for burning at Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. Continuing research at Harappa in 1980s and after the American Harappa Archaeological Research Project and at Mohenjo-daro at a joint German-Italian team of architects, archaeologists and geologists from technical universities of Aachen and the Italian Institute for Middle and Far East, ISEMO, in Rome has shown that the foundations of Harappa are fundamentally different from those of Mohenjo-daro. Harappa undoubtedly has a long history predating the mature period. The city grew organically from a smaller settlement possibly as old as 3500 BCE, whereas Mohenjo-daro appears to have been constructed later out of the nothing on an artificially raised foundation, presumably to protect it from flooding. By the Indus River, a colossal man-made platform 200 meters broad and 400 meters long, most of which has since subsided down to the depth of 7 meters into the alluvial silt, rides contour urban. Unfortunately, at Mohenjo-daro, unlike Harappa, where excavation has continued up to the present day, it is not possible to examine the deeper levels of foundations. Firstly, because of the highly saline water table, and secondly, because excavation has been banned by government of Pakistan on the advice of UNESCO, which has conducted an international rescue effort beginning in 1974. The modern research program at Mohenjo-daro has therefore consisted firstly of using previously unpublished registers of 1926 excavation site in details for patterns that may have escaped the notice of the original excavator, and secondly of applying essentially non-invasive investigative techniques to the ruins. Thus, unmanned hot air balloons with cameras have taken aerial photographs of the site, which have been compared with aerial photographs taken during early excavations. Specifically designed vacuum cleaners have removed loose debris from the surface layers of the site to reveal new buried artifacts. Cores have been drilled into the earth to depth of 18 meters and examined to establish times of occupation, times of activities, and environmental data. For example, household waste dumps were greyish-brown color, suggestive of fire burning notes rights, whereas light brown areas and grey areas, especially fragmentary bones and tiny pieces of broken pottery, were suggestive of normal household dumping. As an alternative to drilling, magnetometer have been used to detect subsurface deposits of baked clay, which becomes magnetized during cooling, a method of detecting buried pottery kilns and burnt bricks. Instruments like measure electrical conductivity so as to differentiate soil types by their resistance have detected two invisible high resistance mud brick platforms 7 meter to 6 long and 6 meter wide and 6 meters deep. Upper and lower town, even buried empty streets dividing the upper from the lower town, has been detected. To all, the number of Indus inscriptions available to the scholars has continued to expand since 1947. New discoveries have not only emerged from excavation of the new Indus sites, such as the putative signboard found at Dholavira 1990s, but also from the excavation of museum collections in India and Pakistan. Hundreds of seals and other inscriptions laid forgotten since 1930s. The corpus of Indus seals and inscriptions edited by Undefatigable Parpola and collaborators with excellent new photographs to replace the original excavation. Photographs appeared in 3 large volumes published in 1987, collections in India, 1999, 1991 collections in Pakistan, and 2010 supplement to Mohenjo-daro and Harappa with sponsorship from UNESCO. At long last would be decipher have virtually entirety of Indus inscription at the fingertips. Architecture. We can take a quick break.